Okay guys, Karel Verhoef here from Conservation Through Tourism, and we're going to discuss conservation today and see where we are, take stock and what the future holds. So generally speaking, conservation, there are different methods of conservation, there are different ways of looking after habitat and biodiversity, and it depends on where in the world you are, but we're going to move closer to African conservation and the methods used here, and then also looking at East Africa and in more particular Tanzania. So there are different ways of that we can look and conserve a piece of land, and some of these methods we inherited from the past, and we really do need to have a re-look and rethink of how we tackle conservation and biodiversity conservation. So in Tanzania, because this is where we are and this is where our projects are mostly run, we are in a very blessed scenario where 25% of the country is conserved in one way or the other. So we are looking at a country that is 1 million square kilometers large, so we're more or less looking at 250,000 square kilometers of habitat that we have currently today in Tanzania that needs to be looked after. I think we can all agree that the main aim of conservation is not looking after the big things like elephant and lion and so things. That is as a result of the conservation of biodiversity and habitat. Without habitat, lions and elephants will not exist, and also the smaller things that no one seems to really care about, and that doesn't bring the emotion to kind of tourists and things like that. So we really need to look at biodiversity conservation, or in an easier way, habitat conservation. So Tanzania, we have different methods of habitat or biodiversity conservation, and some of these are older models and some of these are tried and tested. But we are here as Conservation Through Tourism to introduce a new form of conservation, or to stimulate the cheapest way of conservation that we can possibly find today. Some of the older methods that are still used today and that are still pretty effective is hunting, and hunting ticks the boxes really well from a conservation method. It looks after habitat and it's a fairly effective and cheap way of conservation. Hunting and the model is not favored these days internationally, so although it's an effective method, it's not something that we can rely on for the future. Then we have another old school method of conservation, and that is just general policing. That is anti-poaching and sending military type skilled personnel into an area, and they just occupy space and police in a fairly aggressive way. Kind of human and wildlife conflict, but also anti-poaching and the general utilization of wildlife by local communities and so forth. Now that is a battle that is very expensive, and it also it's really not very effective in large areas like national parks and reserves that are over 30 or 40,000 square kilometers. It's very hard to occupy with a force or a policing method of conservation. And then we have seen that the cheapest way of conservation is through tourism. Tourists pay entrance fees into national parks and reserves or protected areas, and they also occupy space, which means that there's less of that park that needs to be policed by anti-poaching or military forces. So we are here to bring conservation and tourism closer together so that the private sector or the tourism part of conservation, that we can bring tourism closer to paying the bills for conservation and occupying the space that makes anti-poaching or that policing force really a lot more affordable. So the problem that we have at the moment is, yes, tourism and conservation should be a lot closer, but we should funnel tourism away from the really busy places where mass tourism is becoming a problem, and we will discuss that, what are the negative effects of mass tourism, or where tourism or the volume of tourism is too much, as opposed to where there's too few or too little tourism in some areas. So we really have to look at how we can funnel tourist numbers or tourism to areas where it's really needed. How can we do that? And the only way that we have found is to actually show people and showcase what those lesser parks, or the parks that are not as often visited, what you can actually see and experience in those parks, and to drive kind of tourism or repeat tourism to those parks and the reserves where tourism is really, really needed, where those park fees that you pay to enter parks and reserves go to the management of that area, and your presence as a tourist actually occupies space, or you become part of that kind of policing force through visiting these parks. So those are the two really easy ways to kind of fund or pay the bills for conservation, is for people just to go to these places and pay their way and pay their park fees or reserve fees or entry fees, to pay the bill for conservation, to put fuel into those land cruisers, to do anti-poaching, and to reduce the size that needs to be policed by anti-poaching forces by actually having camps and lodges in areas where a presence will then, in a way, police an area. So those are the two kind of ways that we suggest that we look at conservation. But in general, the main problem with conservation at the moment is if there's no value created on a piece of land, then over time, and because of the pressure of the increase in human population, we will lose that area anyway. So very important that we need to create value. Value to who? And that is the big question at the moment. And the answer to that we have found is that we really need to create value for three parts of a country. One is government. We can't do conservation without creating value for government, and park fees and park entry fees and value added tax and those things that an area or a piece of land would create would look after value that is being created for government. So first of all, there's no point in not working with government in conservation, and there has to be value created for government. Secondly, very importantly, that there must be value created for the people that live around area that we're trying to conserve, and without that, population growth or the need to enhance our lives as humans, and because we as humans would always value ourselves more than any other species, if there's not enough value that's created by land for the people around that particular piece of land, over time we will lose it anyway. So how do we create value for people when a piece of land is conserved or protected? And that is through job creation and really the secondary flow of money that goes into buying of supplies for lodges or construction of lodges and roads, but ultimately creating jobs for the community around a piece of land is vitally important in the successful conservation of that piece of land. So now we have covered government, we have covered the people around this particular area that we are trying to look after, but it also needs to create value for investors or the private sector within that area. So it means that those private people that invest in accommodation or services or transport within a national park also need to have a return on their investment. And for them to have a return, we need to create the infrastructure and the stability for those people to invest in an area, and for an operation, whether it's a safari operation or accommodation operation, to successfully also have return on their investment. So here we can see that it really is a joint effort from government, from the people around a national park or game reserve, and then also the private sector that are investors in that area, for them all to have enough value to keep this wheel turning, to keep enough reason to protect this piece of land otherwise we will lose it anyway. So we are on a drive to really stimulate tourism into areas where it's really needed. Here we are looking at faraway places, unfortunately. We are looking at Nyerere National Park, Katavi, Udzungwa, and we will obviously drive this message to go further into the rest of Africa, where we're really trying to, through tourism, through pioneering tourism, through walking safaris, through different ways of stabilizing an area, to create enough value for government, for communities, and also for the private sector to look after a piece of land. So that is really our message, and our message is to really bring the private sector, government, and conservation authorities together so that we can create that value, entice those visitors to actually visit places where their money make a real difference, and for the end consumer, or for you out there as an individual, for your money to really make a difference in this conservation cycle, for private entities to also spread the word and invest in areas that are not often visited, and for governments to have then enough reason to keep on conserving those parks.